I was standing in my kitchen, stirring dinner the way I always do after a long day, letting the smell of garlic and warm herbs settle my nerves when my phone buzzed on the counter. Normally I'd ignore it, assuming it was some random notification or a sale I didn't need. But something inside me, maybe intuition, maybe fate, made me reach for it. An unknown number stared back at me. I opened the message without a second thought, still holding the spoon in my hand. And in the next heartbeat, everything I believed about my life cracked open. The photo almost slipped from my fingers. There was Daniel, my husband, lying in a bed that clearly wasn't ours, his arm around a woman who looked far too proud of herself. She was smiling at the camera like she'd just won some twisted competition. And beneath that image were the words that cut deeper than the betrayal itself. He said you wouldn't care anymore. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. My knees wobbled and I steadied myself against the counter, trying to make sense of the impossible. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Instead, a cold stillness washed through me, the kind that comes right before a storm chooses where to strike. My hands shook as I typed, "Who is this?" The response came instantly, arrogant and poisonous. And with every message the woman sent, I felt something inside me shift, something hardening, something waking up. My world wasn't just breaking, it was reshaping itself, piece by jagged piece, into a version of me I hadn't met yet, but was suddenly desperate to know. When she replied, calling herself the woman he actually loves, something inside me twisted, not just from pain, but from the sheer audacity. I remember staring at the screen, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears as I typed back, "Why send this to me?" I needed to understand the mind of someone who would proudly announce herself as the wrecking ball of my marriage. Her answer came with a venom that almost felt rehearsed. "Because he said you were basically gone." Each word tightened around me like a rope. She wanted to hurt me, and she thought she already had. But what she didn't know was that my hurt didn't explode outward. It sank inward. It sharpened. As she continued to type, adding that Daniel told her I wouldn't make a scene, the sadness I expected never arrived. Instead, I felt a strange clarity spreading through my chest, a kind of cold truth settling where love used to be. I looked around my kitchen, the steam rising from the pot, the quiet hum of the fridge, everything suddenly too normal for what I had just seen. Daniel was supposed to be at work, working late, actually. Funny how lies sound so harmless until you see the picture that kills them. My mind raced through memories, little moments that didn't make sense before but suddenly clicked together like pieces of a dark puzzle. The extra showers, the distant eyes, the way he said he was tired but never seemed drained. And as I stood there holding the phone like it was some cursed artifact, I realized something important. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a man who believed I was too small, too quiet, too soft to fight back. He thought I'd simply disappear. And that thought, more than the photo, more than the messages, lit a fire in me I didn't know I still carried. I stared at the picture again, letting every detail burn itself into my memory. The curve of her smile, the way Daniel's arm settled around her, the rumpled sheets that had once meant safety for us. My stomach twisted so violently I had to grip the counter to steady myself. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the realization that he felt comfortable enough to pose for this, as if he believed he was untouchable, as if I no longer existed as anything besides an inconvenience he could quietly erase. That was the part that broke something deeper than my heart. When I finally managed to breathe, it came out shaky, uneven. I kept replaying his last goodbye that morning, the casual kiss on my forehead, the soft, "See you tonight." It had felt so normal then, routine even, but now it echoed like a lie carved into stone. I felt a chill crawl over my skin, the kind that wasn't sadness, but awakening. A shift. I'd spent years thinking strength meant patience, holding the peace, smoothing edges, but strength looks different when someone kicks the foundation out from under you. In that moment, mine began to take a new shape, quiet, steely, calculated. I put the phone down on the table and stood there, letting the silence settle around me. The kitchen smelled warm and familiar, but nothing inside me felt familiar anymore. I could feel anger rising, not wild or explosive, but controlled, like a flame that knows exactly where to burn. I wasn't going to scream or beg or crumble the way he always assumed I would. No. Something inside me whispered that this was just the beginning. And as I wiped my hands, turned off the stove, and reached for my bag, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Daniel had no idea who he just created. When Daniel finally walked through the door that night, I felt my whole body tighten, like every nerve suddenly woke up at once. He came in humming softly, dropping his keys on the table, completely unaware of the storm waiting for him. "Hey, babe, dinner smells great," he said, smiling in that easy way he always did after work. For a split second, I studied him the way you study a stranger, looking for signs you somehow missed. His shirt was crisp, his hair still neat, and he smelled like his usual cologne. Ordinary. So painfully ordinary. But nothing about him felt familiar anymore. I stood there in the kitchen, arms crossed, the phone already unlocked in my hand. "Who's the woman?" I asked, my voice so cold it surprised even me. He blinked at me, confused at first, then cautious. "What woman?" he asked, tilting his head the way he always did when he wanted to charm his way out of something. I didn't say a word. I just held up the photo. The moment he saw it, the blood drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like he was searching for a script he'd forgotten. Watching him panic almost felt like watching justice take its first breath. "Hannah, listen, I can explain," he finally stuttered, stepping toward me with his hands raised. I stepped back before he could touch me, and that tiny movement hit him harder than any slap would have. "Really?" I said. "Because she told me you said I wouldn't care." The words tasted metallic in my mouth, sharp and bitter. He shook his head, sputtering. "She misunderstood." The desperation in his voice didn't soften me. It clarified everything. "Funny," I said, letting out a dry laugh. "You didn't look misunderstood in her bed." And in that charged silence, something inside me shifted again, pushing me further into a version of myself I wasn't done discovering yet. He reached for my arm again, almost out of instinct, like he thought physical closeness would buy him forgiveness. But the moment his fingertips brushed the air near me, something in me recoiled. I wasn't the woman who softened at his touch anymore. "It was a mistake," he rushed out, "just once." The lie was so effortless, it almost offended me more than the cheating itself. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, how he was already shaping a version of the story where he was the victim of a momentary lapse. He had no idea how far past that moment I already was. "Just once?" I repeated, tilting my head the way he used to. "Daniel, do you know how insulting it is that you think I'm that stupid?" He opened his mouth again, probably ready with another script, another excuse meant to sound heartfelt, but built on nothing. I didn't let him speak. "I'm done listening." The sentence left my mouth quieter than I expected, but it carried weight, real weight. And I watched him stumble back, as if he finally realized he wasn't talking to the same Hannah he walked out on that morning. This was someone he couldn't manipulate with a sigh and a half-hearted apology. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time that night, he looked small. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered, voice trembling with fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the comfort I provided. "But you did," I said, steady and controlled. "And what hurts the most isn't the cheating. It's that you thought I wouldn't do anything about it." His eyes flickered with panic, the kind that comes when a man realizes he misjudged the woman he depended on. And as he stood there, drowning in his own excuses, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me, a calm determination that was quickly becoming my new version of strength. As he kept rambling, trying to stitch together excuses that didn't even fit, I felt my focus sharpen in a way I'd never experienced before. His voice faded into the background, a mixture of desperation and denial that sounded more like noise than truth. I watched his face, the twitch in his jaw, the sweat forming near his temple, the way his eyes darted like he was searching for a version of me that no longer existed. Something inside me clicked. I wasn't reacting from pain anymore. I was observing, studying, planning. And that shift, subtle but powerful, gave me an advantage he couldn't feel yet. He finally stopped talking, maybe realizing his words were landing on stone. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, spreading his hands helplessly. I almost pitied him. Almost. "You don't have to say anything," I answered, "because I already know everything I need to know." I watched that sentence hit him like a silent verdict. His shoulders drooped, his breathing grew shallow, and a flicker of terror crossed his face. Not because he feared losing me, but because he feared losing the life he'd built on my loyalty. That realization didn't ache. It empowered me. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle in my chest. "This ends now," I told him. Not loudly, not angrily, but with a calm so absolute it made him flinch. In that moment, I felt the shift fully. The transition from the woman who got the message to the woman who would decide what happened next. He reached for me one last time, but I stepped back, drawing an invisible line between us that he could no longer cross. And as he stood there, stunned by a silence he couldn't manipulate, I felt the first spark of resolve ignite into something much bigger, something that would carry me into the next move I already knew I'd make. After Daniel finally retreated into silence, I walked to my home office with a steadiness that surprised even me. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They moved with purpose, like they already knew exactly what to reach for. I opened the drawer where we kept years of financial documents, statements, receipts, little pieces of paper that suddenly felt like clues I'd been too loyal to examine. The faint smell of old paper and ink wrapped around me as I spread everything across the desk. Each page felt like a breadcrumb leading straight into the truth he thought he had buried. I started with the bank statements, the ones I barely glanced at before because I trusted him. And just like that, the first crack of confirmation stared right back at me. Charges at restaurants we'd never been to, weekday hotel stays that made no sense, payments that didn't match the stories he fed me. My stomach twisted, but not from heartbreak, from validation, from clarity. It was strange how betrayal, when caught in the open, became less of a wound and more of a target. I clicked through his hidden folders next, the ones I'd pretended not to notice before. And there they were. Photos, messages, evidence he'd carelessly underestimated me to find. Then came the prenup. The dusty envelope tucked behind old tax returns, the one he probably forgot existed. When I pulled it out and saw my own handwriting on the flap, a slow, powerful calm washed over me. I remembered the day we signed it, how he'd laughed and said I'd never need protection from him, how young and trusting I had been. But inside that document lay the very clause that now felt like armor. Infidelity equals full rights to shared assets. Reading those words didn't break me. They rebuilt me. Because for the first time since the photo, I felt something solid beneath my feet again. Leverage. Once I gathered all the documents, I sat down at the edge of the desk and just breathed for a moment, letting the reality settle without crushing me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. And for the first time, that silence felt like an ally instead of a punishment. I looked at the stack in front of me. Statements, charges, screenshots, photos, and that prenup glowing like a loaded weapon. None of it felt chaotic. It felt organized, intentional, almost surgical. This wasn't rage guiding me. This was clarity. Cold, precise, necessary clarity. My next move was as natural as reaching for a light switch. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Ms. Clark's contact, the lawyer Daniel never liked because she was too sharp. I finally understood why. When she answered, her voice was steady, warm, familiar in a way I didn't realize I needed at that moment. "Hannah," she said, "everything all right?" I let the truth spill out in one breath. "My husband cheated. I have proof." There was no tremor in my voice, no crack, just strength, and that alone felt like a victory. Ms. Clark didn't gasp or coddle me. She responded like a general. Do you want the hardest possible outcome for him? Yes, I answered without thinking, without pausing, without doubting. I want him to lose everything. The words rolled out of me with a certainty that felt like reclaiming a piece of myself he'd tried to erase. Ms. Clark exhaled slowly, a predator recognizing another. Then bring everything you have. We'll destroy him. Hearing that sentence lit something electric inside me. I gathered every document, every file, every screenshot, scanning them meticulously, each beep of the scanner sounding like a countdown to the life he thought he'd never lose. And as I hit send on the last email, I felt the ground shift again, this time in my favor. When I finally closed my laptop, the weight of everything I'd uncovered settled into a strange, powerful calm across my chest. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't second-guessing myself. Instead, I felt grounded, almost anchored, like I had stepped into a version of myself I should have met years ago. I walked through the house slowly, noticing details I'd overlooked before. The framed photos on the hallway wall, the scent of the candles I lit out of habit, the echoes of a life built on trust I no longer owed him. None of it hurt anymore. It simply felt like evidence from another timeline. I stood near the living room window, watching the night settle in, the streetlights glowing softly against the dark. For a moment, I let myself remember the woman I used to be, the one who believed in Daniel without hesitation, who made excuses for his distance, who ignored the little alarms her intuition tried to sound. That woman had been loyal, devoted, patient, but she had also been blind. And now, seeing clearly felt like breathing clean air after years underwater. I didn't mourn her. I thanked her quietly, then let her fade. Because the version standing here now had something she never did, undeniable proof and the guts to use it. As I turned away from the window, I felt a new kind of energy rising in me, focused, sharp, unstoppable. I gathered the files into a neat folder and placed it by the door, ready for my meeting with Ms. Clark. Every step, every scanned document, every truth uncovered had brought me closer to this moment. And deep down, beneath the calm exterior, I could feel something else forming, a plan, a path, a quiet but devastating retaliation Daniel never saw coming. By the time I went to bed, one thing was clear. The next move was mine, and I intended to make it count. The next morning, I woke up with a purpose so sharp it felt like it had settled into my bones overnight. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't hesitant. I moved through the house with a quiet confidence, choosing my clothes with intention, brushing my hair slowly, almost ceremonially. Every gesture felt like preparation, not for a fight, but for a revelation. I messaged Daniel to meet me for lunch, wording it carefully, lightly, the way someone trying to reconcile would. I knew he'd cling to that hope. It was part of the plan. When I arrived at the restaurant, I chose a table near the center, visible, open, impossible to ignore. The place was elegant, quiet, full of soft clinking glasses and murmured conversations, the kind of setting where reputations could unravel with a single scene. I placed the prenup inside my bag, the divorce papers tucked neatly beside it, and waited. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. In fact, I felt strangely present, aware of every sound, every detail, the smell of fresh bread, the warm lighting, the polished silverware. It was the perfect stage, and I was ready. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, scanning the room until he spotted me. I saw the relief in his eyes, the hopeful curve of his smile, like he thought last night's confrontation had softened into forgiveness. He approached the table with that same familiar warmth he used to disarm me, but this time, it slid right off. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down. "Thanks for meeting me." I watched him settle into the chair across from me, clueless, comfortable, still believing he was the man in control. And in that moment, seeing him so unaware of what was coming, I realized just how poetic justice could be. He picked up the menu, pretending everything was normal, and for a second I just watched him, watched the calm, the comfort, the absolute ignorance. Then I reached into my bag and placed the prenup on the table between us. Not harshly, not dramatically, just deliberately. His eyes shifted from the menu to the document, confusion settling across his face. "What's that?" he asked, voice tight. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment stretch. "Your goodbye," I said softly. And watching the meaning hit him was almost cinematic. He grabbed the papers like he needed to prove to himself they weren't real. As he read the clause, his face drained of color the same way it had when he first saw the photo. "Hannah, wait, no, this isn't necessary," he whispered, panic cracking through the surface he'd tried to keep smooth. I kept my voice calm. "You cheated, you lied, you told another woman I didn't matter." The denial came instantly. "It wasn't serious." I tilted my head, feeling nothing but clarity. "It doesn't need to be. The prenup doesn't care if you loved her or not." His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an exit. There wasn't one. As the waiter approached to refill our water, he slowed down, catching enough of the tension to understand he'd walked into something personal. Daniel noticed too, and his voice dropped into a desperate whisper. "Not here. Please," he begged, but that only confirmed how much he cared about appearances, image, control. I kept my gaze steady, my voice even. "Here is perfect." The words felt like a blade slipped neatly between truth and consequence. And for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt the scale tip fully, finally, in my direction. Daniel's breathing grew uneven as he flipped through the documents, his fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. The restaurant around us carried on, clinking forks, soft conversations, but he seemed frozen in a different reality, one where he was no longer protected by my silence. I watched him swallow hard, watched the shame creep up his neck like a slow tide. He wasn't grieving our marriage. He was panicking about the consequences. "Hannah, don't do this," he whispered, like he still believed he had the power to talk me down. That part almost made me laugh. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a calm that only unsettled him more. "I already did," I said, lifting my bag onto my shoulder. His eyes darted to the other diners, who were now pretending not to eavesdrop. But curiosity leaked from every table. People noticed. People whispered. And Daniel's humiliation thickened in the air until it was almost visible. I leaned in just enough for him to hear the next sentence clearly. "You should start getting used to people seeing who you really are." His face crumpled, not from sorrow, but from the fear of losing the version of himself he performed for the world. When I turned to leave, he reached out, but his hand only grasped the empty air behind me. I walked past the waiter, past the tables, past the soft murmurs that followed me like a trail of truth. Stepping outside felt like stepping into my own skin again, steady, owned, reclaimed. The sun hit my face, warm and unapologetic, and in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't the end of my revenge. It was merely the unveiling. Because now that the world had seen him break, it was time to finish what I'd started. A week later, when Daniel showed up at the house, I wasn't surprised. Desperation has a schedule, and his was right on time. I watched him from the window as he paced on the porch, running a hand through his hair like he was rehearsing an apology he thought would crack me open. But I didn't rush to the door. I let him wait, let him feel the silence he had forced on me for months without even noticing. When I finally opened the door, he looked smaller than I remembered, like guilt had peeled away whatever confidence he had left. "Hannah, please," he said, voice trembling. "We need to talk." He stepped inside, eyes darting around as if he expected to see traces of himself missing already. And he wasn't wrong. The house looked brighter without his presence, cleaner somehow, like it had exhalado after years of holding its breath. "You're taking everything," he said, the panic in his voice rising. "I'll be ruined." His fear didn't hit me the way it once would have. Instead, it landed exactly where it belonged. On him, not on me. "You should have thought about that," I said calmly, "before posing for photos with your mistress." The truth felt steady on my tongue. No bitterness, no regret, just honesty. She meant nothing, he insisted, sounding almost offended that I didn't accept that excuse. I watched him carefully, studying every flinch, every desperate blink. For years, I mistook that face for vulnerability. Now I saw it clearly for what it was: self-preservation. But the consequences mean everything, I replied. The shift in his expression was immediate, like he finally understood this wasn't a fight. It was the aftermath, the reckoning. And for the first time in our entire marriage, the power between us wasn't just balanced. It was mine. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out the small box I had prepared days earlier. It was light in my hands, almost deceptively so, considering the weight it carried. When I handed it to him, he looked confused, like he expected something symbolic or sentimental, some gesture that hinted at forgiveness. But when he opened the lid and saw what was inside, his face collapsed. A toothbrush, 2 shirts, a pair of socks. Nothing more, nothing extra, nothing he didn't earn. "What's this?" he whispered, his voice cracking around the edges. "Everything you get to keep," I said. He stared down at the items like they were pieces of a life he no longer recognized. "This can't be it," he insisted, shaking his head in disbelief. "Hannah, please. We built a life together." His plea didn't hit me like it once would have. It floated right past me, weightless. I stood there watching him cling to a version of us that only existed in his mind. "No," I said gently, almost kindly. "We built a life, and you decided it wasn't enough." His eyes glossed over with a kind of panic that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with losing comfort, stability, control. He stepped toward me, holding the box like it might suddenly transform into something more meaningful if he just begged hard enough. "I can fix this," he said, desperation tightening every word. I met his gaze with a calm he couldn't touch. "You can't fix something you never valued," I answered. For a moment, neither of us moved. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels final, heavy, absolute. And standing there, watching him crumble under the reality he created, I realized something powerful. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was closure. Mine, not his. I walked him to the door with a calmness he couldn't understand, the box still clutched in his hands like a punishment he hadn't expected. When I opened the door, the cool air rushed in, brushing against my skin almost like reassurance. Daniel stood on the threshold, looking at me like he was seeing a stranger, someone he never learned, someone he never bothered to know. "Is this really it?" he whispered, voice barely holding itself together. I met his eyes and nodded once. "Yes, exactly what you deserve." The words didn't shake. They landed like truth finally delivered. He lingered for a moment, as if waiting for the version of me who used to fix everything, soften everything, forgive everything. But she was gone, replaced by someone who understood her worth far too clearly to bargain with it. When I closed the door, the click of the lock felt like the final punctuation to a chapter I should have ended long ago. I leaned against the wood for a breath, not to steady myself, but to savor the moment. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine again. Not a shared space, not a battlefield. Mine. As I walked back through the hallway, sunlight drifted across the floor, warm and quiet, like the world was finally aligning with the peace I'd fought to reclaim. Daniel had lost the house, the savings, the car, and most importantly, the power he wielded so carelessly. The photo meant to break me had become the very weapon that rebuilt me. And as I stepped deeper into the home that now held only my presence, my choices, my future, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Pure, unshaken, deserved freedom.